to the increasing amount of alienation many feel towards their suffering. And it can be argued that a decrease in control over our institutions and over our universities also share a part in this. Universities in Quebec, as well as in North America, are no longer for students. They are for corporations. They receive private funding and serve the agenda of large exploitative companies, which results in the increased use of animal testing on campuses. As Morgan demonstrated in her presentation yesterday, there is more of an interest in desensitizing students than there is to improving or eradicating the use of non-human animals. So the question that I hope that we can answer in our discussion after Isaac's presentation today is, how do we bring non-human animals in? Other animals are also affected by the economic and social policies which marginalize, oppress, and further our social conditions and the social conditions of many human lives. So how do we, and should we, strive to include them in our struggles?
Okay, so we'll move on to my part now, and I want to try to get into some of the questions that Agatha started to bring up. I just want to start by saying that I'm going to make some of my own suggestions a bit in what I'm going to say, but I absolutely want to hear, would love your critiques and other suggestions as we get to the discussion after. So my question is primarily practical. How can and should we act as an advocates in the context of broader or superficially separate political issues mobilization? I start from the assumption, as has been discussed extensively here, that there are important parallels and links between animal issues and issues of social justice, such as the connections between the exploitation of other animals for food and the exploitation of workers, or the linked consequences that cultures of domination have for both women and other animals. This situation, as well as the implications it has for activities as activists for both animal rights and social progress more broadly, have already been discussed. But the mere acknowledgement of such intersections still leaves at least two crucial questions unanswered, especially in the context of practical activism. These are, firstly, the best approach to take when faced with the near inevitable fact that activists working on other issues we see as connected to the oppression of other animals may not see the intersections of oppressions that we do, or take an interest in the oppression of other animals at all. And secondly, how and when should we assert such intersections in the absence of consensus on their presence or import? In order to address these problems, I want to take an approach which, while rooted in broader institutional factors, can offer an orientation towards individual political action for each and every one of us. So the approach which I'll outline here centers on the idea that normalizing a place for other animals in political discussions, in part through our involvement in social movements, can be a vital undertaking for us as advocates for other animals. There's sometimes a reluctance to bring consideration of the oppression of other animals into other social movements or political discussion more generally. Reasons for this may lie in worries over unfairly co-opting separate issues or hindering rather than helping a cause in which one believes. Though I do not think these fears are completely ungrounded, I argue they're rooted in political structures which fundamentally exclude other animals. In order to end the oppression of other animals, such structures must be challenged, and an important part of this challenge can come through an expansion of discourse in social movements. Of course, arguing for less compartmentalized social movements, so moving away from kind of single-issue thinking. And I think that an important parallel can be drawn here with the manner in which much of contemporary political life is atomized. The liberal tradition of political thought often sees us as individual political actors, so as a result, political discussion often involves one individual perspective counterposed to another, followed by compromise or the victory of one position over another. What I think is particularly crucial here is the manner in which they sometimes orient how we present ourselves as political actors. So you often have the sense that our arguments and views must take into account the perspective of other actors. For example, this is drawing on a bit of a different field, but the philosopher of religion, Robert Audi, has argued that presenting or moderating our views in a manner which takes the background and horizon of other human political actors into account comprises civic virtues, kind of ideas we have to be aware of how others are going to comprehend us. Charles Taylor's dialogical account of politics emphasizes the importance of adequately recognizing and attempting to understand the positions and backgrounds of others as a crucial step to uncovering shared values, thus enabling political and ethical progress. But whilst I'm sympathetic to such accounts on some levels, there is, of course, a fairly obvious omission here. Political discussions and processes which are being described in these accounts are incapable, by their very nature, of directly or equally including other animals or their concerns, yet nonetheless they're very often tied up with the oppression of other animals. So faced with the situation, I agree that we need to rethink our political role as advocates for the interests of other animals. We strive to reject the notion that our opposition to the exploitation of other animals can be seen as our personal, atomized perspective, which must be reconciled with the opposing perspectives of other humans on these issues. Rather, we must see our role as giving a voice to the voiceless, although I do understand this bit of a loaded expression. By using our political agency to advocate for an end to the oppression of other animals, we are firstly acting as, in a sense, representatives of other animals and not simply as representatives of our own personal view. The responsibility which I see this position as entailing means that we ought to be much more hesitant to compromise or moderate in recognition of other human political positions. Moreover, by acting as a sort of representative, I argue that we also contribute to highlighting the poverty of political discourse and institutions which inherently marginalize other animals. Without detracting from our own beliefs, motivations, and commitments as individual advocates for other animals, I want to stress that such advocacy not be seen as simply the attempt to argue for the importance of our own position, but also as a way of representing the interests of other animals, and indeed a way of trying to reshape how political discussions happen. I think the situation I've described here plays out in social movements more particularly in at least two ways. Firstly, we may as activists involved in movements see ourselves as but one voice amongst many, and thus feel inclined to express our views in relation to those of others. But I would argue that this fails to fully appreciate our role as advocates for other animals that I started to suggest before. Secondly, social movements may wish to present themselves as a whole in a manner which fits into existing political structures, for example, by attempting to relate individual positions of individuals outside of the movement as a way of being more effective, garnering support, and so on. However, I think it's precisely this political structure which must be overcome, and I argue that we should seek to do this in part through social movements. And so, what I said so far is very theoretical, and I want to turn to some more practical concerns of how we can do this in social movements. As I indicated earlier, I'm starting from the premise that nearly every social movement has some connection to the situation of other animals. And furthermore, given the problem of exclusion inherent to prevalent political structures, which I've outlined above, I argue that one of our primary strategies as advocates for other animals ought to be the transformation of discourse to be more inclusive to the extent to which it's possible of other animals. By this, I do not mean that we should seek to orient every social movement towards animal rights as we might think of it as sort of a single issue matter, in the sense, we don't want every social movement to just suddenly put "Go Vegan, Total Liberation" on their posters, but rather I argue that by amplifying the voices of other animals through our own political agency, we can first of all contribute positively to the movement in question by rendering it more diverse and informed of the considerations of non-human animals which might influence it. And moreover, I think that doing so can contribute to a broader struggle to bring animal voices into political life, and in a way, which need not detract from or harm social movements which are both valuable on a human level, and in many cases can lead to important advances in the situation of other animals. I think that a concrete example of how such a course of action might be undertaken can be found in the mobilization to oppose the Quebec government's Plan Nord, which means Northern Plan. And so this is, in brief, a massive plan to exploit natural resources in northern areas of Quebec, covering about 72% of the total area of the province. Important mobilization opposition to this plan has come in particular from environmental and indigenous groups, but this is an issue which also has implications for other animals. So in addition to the broader manner in which the capitalist exploitation of forests, minerals, and rivers is tied to similar capitalist exploitation of other animals, the significant amount of ecological damage proposed by the plan would of course have impacts on the other animals who live in the areas of Quebec in question. So by more explicitly seeking to bring concern for other animals into such movement, we can in the first instance bring considerations which are vital to the particular issue. But in my view, we're also doing something bigger. We're attempting to transform patterns of political discourse so as to make them more inclusive of the concerns of other animals. And this endeavor, which is naturally not limited to social movements, seeks to advance political culture as a whole. Nonetheless, I think that social movements such as the one I've described provide an important tool for doing so, and a particularly important place in which to engage in this kind of transformation, due to some features which I think are common to a lot of social movements. So notable amongst these are grassroots participatory culture, which is perhaps more attuned to recognizing marginalized voices, and in some cases a less rigid institutional structure which is more conducive to this attempt to move away from political structures which are incapable of fully taking the interests of other animals into account. And so what I want to emphasize is that in using this tool, we're not co-opting social movements, The strategy I'm advocating for is primarily focus on expansion of political discourse and inclusivity. Be sure such expansion can, if successful, lead to a given movement affording greater concern to other animals in its actions and aims, but I want to highlight the notion this stems primarily from an amelioration of the movement's